So I've got good news and I've got bad news. The good news is that Lab Goggle Pikachu will be making a comeback in this video with a vengeance. As such, there are a bunch of research-related rabbit holes for us to explore. The bad news is because of the depth of these rabbit holes, it's not all going to fit into one video. This video made possible thanks to viewers and patrons like you. Thanks! Welcome back, and a super welcome to everybody new. So, briefly, the video last week, it was a rough one to make, so I imagine it was even harder to watch, and I just want to thank everybody who reached out on Twitter, on the comment section here, Discord. You know, it was very sweet and very nice, and I would hug all of you if I could. Also, despite my requests and protestations, there was a bit of an influx to my Patreon, so thank you. Most of the new patrons missed the last patron live stream, but I do those every month. You'll also be able to vote on upcoming topics after I do the personality and astrology one. That was the last topic winner. And also get dibs on a project I'm working on for the channel's anniversary. So yeah. If you are new to the channel, hi, I'm Cass. I've got a cognitive psychology PhD, and in this series we've been going through the New York Times bestseller 12 Rules for Life and Antidote to Chaos by Jordan B. Peterson. Last thing before starting, there are different lighting and icon setups to indicate what source we're working from. This means we're either working straight from the lobster's mouth or paraphrasing it. This means I'm responding to what was written or exploring possible implications. And this is for science. In this video, it's going to be things not referenced by Peterson. Alright, let's find out how we always lying.
You ready? Why the fuck you lying? Why you always lying?
You can use words to manipulate the world into delivering what you want. This is what it means to act politically. This is spin. It's the specialty of unscrupulous marketers, salesmen, advertisers, pickup artists, slogan-possessed utopians, and psychopaths. It's a speech people engage in when they attempt to influence and manipulate others. It's what university students do when they write an essay to please the professor, instead of articulating and clarifying their own ideas. It's what everyone does when they want something and decide to falsify themselves to please and flatter. It's scheming and sloganeering and propaganda.
Yes, of course, language can be used to manipulate the world. The issue is if we want to categorize language into these two forms, truth or manipulation. And an implication of this is that if you aren't telling the truth, then you are therefore trying to manipulate the world. Although, this is Peterson we're talking about, so of course, he's trying to put two discrete categories and fit everything into those categories. It's either box A or box B. Truth or manipulation, order, or chaos. Also, to tease a video topic that's on the horizon, is the issue of recovered memories. People's truth can include things that are patently not true. False memories can be implanted in people, and in the end, the person believes something occurred that didn't. So a person speaking about those recovered memories would technically not be telling the truth, even though to them it is true. Kinda seems like maybe two discrete language bins isn't going to work out. This acting politically thing. Maybe this is another instance of me not taking the right classes in undergrad to be able to understand the context of this phrase, but what? The closest I can come, I think, is somebody who's playing the bureaucratic game, trying to get a raise, a promotion, improve their social standing, whatever. And I'm also having to remind myself that this is probably different than acting diplomatically, which is something I've absolutely heard of. Is this a dog whistle that I'm not familiar with? I wonder who Peterson means by slogan-possessed utopians. Facts don't care about your feelings probably isn't one of those slogans. Hypothetically, how would one communicate the truth to another person who doesn't already accept or believe this to be the truth? Wouldn't that take persuasive speech, where you're trying to influence that other person to accept the truth? Hang on, you know what? We're playing pedantry games here with truth and words and stuff, and playing these games with Peterson suck. Yes, one definition of manipulate includes controlling or influencing something cleverly, unfairly, or unscrupulously. But we aren't arguing against the nitty-gritty of the word choice. I'm arguing against this idea that speech has to be truth or manipulation. I'm also arguing against the idea here that everyone falsifies themselves when they want something. Final thing before moving on from this first paragraph of this section. As a former university student, and on the other side of the equation as well, these types of assignments happen when you have an underperforming student, a bad assignment, an inept instructor, or some combination of those. With some professors, this is the only way to get a good grade. They don't want to help you develop your writing or your critical thinking skills, they just want to know that you can regurgitate the answer. Hell, with that phrasing, I'm guilty of it. In classes with over 150 students per section, but needing to incorporate writing into the testing, you can bet your ass that the essays were graded by making sure a key concept was adequately described. It would be impossible to get the test back in anything resembling a timely manner otherwise. As is so often the case with this book, the sweeping generalizations aren't capturing the subtleties that can lead to these bad things that are described. Surprise. Peterson describes this type of speech as being driven from a desire, and this is partially based on the research of Alfred Adler. Some examples of desires, which are referred to as life lies: converting people to your religious or other ideological belief, being correct, gaining attention or wanting to be liked, trying to reduce conflict,
To garner the benefits of martyrdom?
or
To capitalize on my vulnerability?
Alfred Adler was a contemporary of Freud and Jung. Adler was a doctor and a psychotherapist, much like the more well-known of that group. Initially, he was part of a discussion group of Freud's, but had a falling out over the aggression drive. After the falling out, he founded the individual psychology school, which emphasizes the inferiority complex as the thing driving development. To avoid completely sidelining this video, take a gander at my Freud video. Same complaints apply. For reference or context, Adler would be brought up in my intro psych course as a sort of kitchen sink inclusion for those behind the different psychodynamic approaches to treatment. And the psychodynamic approaches borrow a lot of techniques and foundations from Freud. LPQ Silver was able to get a copy of this chapter, sort of. Peterson's reference wasn't working for me, but I was able to find this chapter in a different book. What is available online as the abstract is on screen now. But it seems like the emphasis of this chapter is to signal boost individual psychology, remember, Adler's baby, in addition to reinforcing the importance of the inferiority complex in development, especially of neuroses. Plus, there's some arguing that people with melancholia, which is what we would call depression today, are doing it for attention. Yay. Peterson then describes somebody who sounds like they're fully in the depths of narcissistic personality disorder, but presumably this applies to anybody engaging in not truthful speech.
Someone living a life lie is attempting to manipulate reality with perception, thought, and action, so that only some narrowly desired and predefined outcome is allowed to exist.
He says that this lifestyle has two underlying premises. First, what you know now will continue to be true for what is good for you down the line. Second, life sucks without intervention. But then Peterson goes to poke holes in these foundations. The issue he puts forth for the first premise is that what you might be doing or trying to get isn't good, but is actually bad. The problem with the second? I'll let him explain it.
The second is even worse. It is valid only if reality is intrinsically intolerable and, simultaneously, something that can be successfully manipulated and distorted. Such speaking and thinking requires the arrogance and certainty that the English poet John Milton's genius identified with Satan, God's highest angel gone most spectacularly wrong. The faculty of rationality inclines dangerously to pride. All I know is all that needs to be known. Pride falls in love with its own creations and tries to make them absolute.
So, if you aren't speaking the truth, you are trying to manipulate the world because you are short-sighted and arrogantly think that reality is mutable. Is that a fair summary of this so far? Pulling in the previous rules, I guess we can practically act like reality can be bargained with, but that's the most we can do with it. Try to make nice with the sky daddy that doesn't have to exist for the bargaining to work. But that doesn't internally mesh, because if we're bargaining with reality, we're wanting something from it, which means we're trying to manipulate the situation. Sometimes I really have to question if the editor actually read this book. Even more damning, Peterson's fundamental, unquestionable truth from Rule 7 was that life is suffering. I guess a distinction can be made between life being bathed in suffering and life being intolerable. But then we're back at pedantry games, and I'm not feeling like playing today. Let's pull up a hypothetical example. Let's even sort of base it on somebody discussed in part 1 for this rule. This hypothetical person has paranoid schizophrenia. They believe, to the core of their being, that there is a governmental conspiracy acting against them. Things they say about this conspiracy would be true for them. It wouldn't probably be reflective of objective truth. I suppose this person's speech would fall into that life-like category in Peterson's framework, as this person is wanting to prove to others that they are right. The world is out to get them, even though it isn't. But this illustrates a fundamental problem with this framework's distinction. It requires that there be some objective truth for all statements to be measured against. And in some sense, yes, there is an objective truth of how things go down, why people acted the way they did, the motives behind what they did, but we don't have access to that. Everything goes through our own personal lens and filters, even when we try to be unbiased. So one person sitting there pointing their finger at everybody who they deem to not be speaking the truth and engaging in a lifeline and therefore manipulative speech, isn't that sort of driven by the desire to be correct oneself and therefore also a lifeline? Peterson describes having known people who have worked to bring about their utopia. One was a left-leaning individual who worked resentfully to try to topple the man, but according to Peterson, it was basically all in his head. The other is a woman who worked to retire at 52 because, as a kid, she decided she wanted to retire at 52. This is described as a problem because how could she possibly know what life at 52 would look like as a kid? Also, how could she understand what retirement would entail? Also, what about her life's meaning? Is anybody getting Eleanor Rigby vibes from this? Sure, it's good to update your goals and dreams and stuff as you grow up and mature, but this implication that we should just discard everything we wanted to do when we were kids just because we're kids and didn't know as much? Why? Or is this subtly looping back to his parenting chapter where he railed really hard against the adultism stuff and the idea that kids could be competent? How dare kids think they know anything about the world? One client's beachfront margarita retirement dream is described as a childish dream that transmutes into a lifeline over time.
That's not a plan. That's a travel poster. After 8 margaritas, you're fit only to await the hangover. After 3 weeks of margarita-filled days, if you have any sense, you're bored stiff and self-disgusted. In a year or less, you're pathetic.
Let this guy have his fucking retirement dream. Maybe he's the type of guy who would enjoy drinking margaritas on the beach every day until he died. Maybe he would get bored of it. It's not like there's other things you can do with your life, like hobbies and stuff. But to categorically go, no, that's a stupid, childish retirement plan. Very on brand for Peterson.
This kind of oversimplification and falsification is particularly typical of ideologues.
NANI?
They adopt a single axiom. Government is bad. Immigration is bad. Capitalism is bad. Patriarchy is bad. Then they filter and screen their experiences and insist ever more narrowly that everything can be explained by that axiom. They believe, narcissistically, underneath all that bad theory, that the world could be put right if only they held the controls.
One of these things is not like the others. Now we are finally getting into a little bit of a logical flow for a bit. Imagine 2 boxes of sin. One box is for commission sins, which happen when you knowingly do bad. This is described as being viewed more negatively historically than the other type of sin. The other box is for omission sins, which occur when you don't stop something bad from happening when you could have. Peterson says that these omission sins are because we're avoiding something, and he's not sure they aren't less sinful than commission sins. Sure, okay, we're talking about sin. Again, why not? Peterson describes a woman living a life of quiet desperation. She's non-confrontational to a fault, she hides in her niche, and does her best to go unnoticed. But she is suffering deep down inside because life is suffering, and she doesn't have meaning in her life to balance it. Sounds like this woman needs to set up some boundaries, like we talked about in part 1. Then we take a turn into authoritarian town, with Peterson saying that it's the noisy troublemakers who go first, but then it's the quiet ones who follow after because they aren't perceived to be vital.
Hiding also does not save the conforming and conventional from disease, insanity, death, and taxes. And hiding from others also means suppressing and hiding the potentialities of the unrealized self. And that's the problem.
Don't hide your truth because the authoritarian police will get you regardless, and besides, we all die. My brain. On the one hand, cool, yeah, don't hide your true self because the world would be missing out on your full potential. On the other hand, of course there's a Jungian overtone to this. This unrealized self smacks of Jung's individuation process in therapy for me. To use the book's phrasing, a person who is not yet individuated has problems with aspects of their personality being suppressed or hiding down in the unconscious. In Jungian therapy, you would work to get these aspects, archetypes, out of hiding and integrated into yourself. If you're new here, I don't scientifically care much for Jung's theories.
If you will not reveal yourself to others, you cannot reveal yourself to yourself. That does not only mean that you suppress who you are, although it also means that. It means that so much of what you could be will never be forced by necessity to come forward. This is a biological truth as well as a conceptual truth.
So behaving boldly and challenging yourself will bring those personality things forward. We'll get to that biological truth in a second. The Jung is all over this. All these parts of your personality hanging out in the shadows. I would like to know the logic behind the ordering here. If you can't be yourself to others, you can't know yourself? I'm still not a counseling psychologist, so this next thought is purely experiential. It seems like there can be cases where a person is unwilling to accept some part of themselves for reasons, perhaps social, so maybe that would fit the others to self-direction Peterson wrote. But it seems more likely that a person would have awareness of themselves but choose not to reveal that to other people. Really, I'm getting hung up on this cannot. You cannot truly know yourself unless you share yourself with others first. But this is pretty consistent with his previous advice, like in the parenting section. Working from the outside in. You don't want your kid to be hated by others or disliked or excluded by others, so they need to act certain ways, instead of concerning yourself with your kid's wants, needs, desires, dreams, them as a person, and then working out from there. Is this implying that the pathway for personal growth is necessity? Well, I guess that sometimes growth does come out of us having to leave our comfort zones, and we don't want to leave our comfort zones, and there I'm going again. We're not playing pedantry games. These little word definition games, I'm over it. We're not doing it today, Peterson. Again, I will let Peterson explain what he means by biological truth.
Researchers have recently discovered that new genes in the central nervous system turn themselves on when an organism is placed or places itself in a new situation. These genes code for new proteins. These proteins are the building blocks for new structures in the brain. This means that a lot of you is nascent in the most physical of senses and will not be called forth by stasis. You have to say something, go somewhere, and do things to get turned on. And if not, you remain incomplete, and life is too hard for anyone incomplete.
Unless I am mistaken, Peterson is talking about epigenetics here. A fucking citation would be a huge help here, so we're going to talk about what I found in a reasonable amount of time, as I refuse to completely do Peterson's job for him. Disclaimer. In addition to not being a counselor, I am also not a geneticist, molecular biologist, anything like that. The closest I come is a biominer that might very well be older than some of you watching this video, so when I did my undergrad, epigenetics was talked about but not really taught. So I'm doing the best I can. If I do get a detail wrong, let me know in the comments and we'll get that correction there. Epigenetics is roughly how the environment is able to impact how genes are expressed without altering the DNA itself. This was originally coined to describe an independent mechanism predicted to exist that changes how the genome is expressed in different parts of the body. Since you've got just one genome, typically, how does a particular cell know it needs to become a neuron or a muscle cell or any type of cell? Short answer for that is there's a bunch of cell signaling stuff that happens during development, so the different parts end up in the correct place. Usually. In addition to the early developmental stuff, there is accumulating evidence that the environment can impact gene expression later in an organism's life. You may have been told that drinking alcohol before your brain is done developing isn't the best idea, and that's because the brain, specifically the neocortex, is still sorting itself out. The instructions for how to get sorted out are in the genome, but the social and physical environment have the ability to modify that. Before we get to a specific example, I will point out that some parts of your brain are constantly generating new neurons, a process called neurogenesis. This happens for things like your olfactory neurons, which are used for smelling things, as well as areas like the hippocampus for learning and memory. This is how new memories are formed. Specific example, predisposition to stress. We're going to go through this example as opposed to others because, quite frankly, this one is the easiest one for me to talk about. It doesn't involve a bunch of transcription or binding sites, so hopefully it'll be easier to convey. Early life stress, pre or post-birth, can have a huge impact on later development, and in mammals, this environment is determined in part by the mother. Grade A rat moms will nurse their pups with an arched back in addition to grooming and licking them. The level of momming influences the pup's later anxiety, fear, and stress responsiveness. There is variability in how well the rat mom will do these behaviors between and within different strains, sort of like rat breeds. Some strains are better at momming, and within a strain, some rats are better at being a mom. Better rat moms tend to produce better future rat moms, irrespective of strain. Said another way, rat pups from a strain that is less nurturing, if raised by a more nurturing mom, will be more nurturing themselves. Likewise, take pups from a nurturing strain and put them in with a non-nurturing mom, and those pups will grow up to not receive rat Christmas cards from their pups either. This would seem to argue that the environment plays a huge role for how nurturing the pups will grow up to be, but epigenetics provides an explanation beyond the environmental wizard did it. The critical thing for this experiment is the expression of a glucocorticoid receptor. So cortisol and other glucocorticoids bind to this type of receptor. Cortisol is a hormone that's involved with a bunch of shit in the body. And yes, that is the technical term for this. Don't look at me funny. In this experiment, they were interested in cortisol's role in the stress response. High levels of chronic stress are associated with higher levels of cortisol just floating around the body. The pups raised by nurturing moms will have increased expression of those receptors and a lower stress response, while pups raised by less nurturing moms will have decreased expression of these receptors and a more pronounced stress response. There are differences in how the relevant proteins are coded from the DNA. So a couple things before we move on. First, your DNA isn't stored in this nice long strands of the double helix thing. It ends up looking more like spaghetti and meatballs because it's wound around these little structures and so it's stored like that. The DNA itself codes for proteins, kind of like Peterson was talking about. And these proteins, it's sort of like computer code almost. There's a beginning and there's an end, and there's sort of signals for where the beginning and end is. In addition to these little flags almost in your DNA code, there's promoter sites, where these things that are sort of like club promoters for gene transcription can attach and be like, hey, we need to make this protein. This is a sexy protein. Let's make this protein. And they bind there and they do that. So in addition to these promoter sites, there are things that can be done to the DNA electrically to increase or decrease the likelihood of transcription. So if an acetyl group is added, it makes it more likely that transcription will occur because the DNA unwinds a bit and it's easier for the transcription stuff to get in there. If a methyl group is added, then the DNA is bound up again and it's harder for the transcription machinery to get in there. Nurtured pups, through acetylation and methylation at certain spots in their DNA, essentially have that promoter trying to get the receptor produced. Non-nurtured pups only really have the methylation keeping the receptors from getting made. This acetylation and methylation is pretty stable, unless you swap the pup into the opposite form of nurturing from what it had been living with. So the environment can impact how your genetic code is expressed. Since Peterson didn't deign to include a reference, we don't know exactly what new discovery he's talking about here. New situation could be anything. I know being put in a new location will result in the formation of new neurons to represent that environment. As described by the previous rat example, new situation could also mean a different home life, in rats at least. While epigenetics has been pretty interesting and sparking a lot of research and pretty robust as far as theories go, it would be really helpful to know what exactly Peterson is talking about here, especially with the things he pulls from the conclusions. With how he's talking about the real-world implication, it seems more like a blank slate approach to explaining why people be like they are instead of the environment playing with the DNA. With epigenetics, some genes may be expressed more, less, amplified, silenced, all based on the information coming in from the environment. To bring this back to Peterson, I don't think we're incomplete epigenetically or biologically if we don't speak the truth all the time. And if we're concerned about completing ourselves biologically, we should be doing a whole lot more than just speaking the truth. A whole bunch of epigenetic upregulation and expression boosts for the different proteins happens when you have increased stress, you become addicted to different things, and a whole lot more. YOLO, my little lobster bitches. Another thing to think about here is underlying this idea that you need to go out and speak your truth because epigenetics is that you going out and doing this will maximize your gene expression and that this would be a good thing. But this isn't necessarily the case. Chronic cocaine use results in some genes being promoted with a coinciding bump in gene expression. Going out and saying your truth that you need more coke generally isn't seen as a positive. Finally, I saved the best little morsel for last. The language is vague enough that Peterson could be talking about the role of proteins in general, as they are the building blocks of us all the way down. However, in this context and framing, it kind of sounds like he's suggesting that new structures would spring up in your brain if you go out and be truthful. Needless to say, you don't grow whole new structures in your brain once you've got the normal structures in place. Unless you have a tumor, and I doubt that's what he's talking about. Is anyone else getting dissolving lobster brain flashbacks? And on that blobby note, let's end it here for this video. Still to come in this chapter. Not being able to say no leads to gulag guards. More pedantic wordplay with things like totalitarian, hell, and, of course, vision. And of course, where would we be without Peterson's constant reminders that life is suffering? But you know what? Life doesn't have to be suffering. Have a good weekend. Bye.